Hi, I'm Robert Dancik. I'm here at the Cool Tools studio in beautiful Wisconsin. And today one of the techniques I'm going to be showing you is called fold forming. It's one of the only really truly new techniques in all of metalworking that has occurred in the last 100 years. It was invented by a fellow by the name of Charles Lewton-Brain. That's his actual name. His company is the Brain Trust. And if you want to take a look online, he's all over the place, as is fold forming. It's a new technique, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to make three-dimensional forms out of perfectly flat metal. It's applicable for virtually any kind of sheet metal, brass, copper, sterling silver, even metal clay that has been formed into like a sheet. You can actually even do it with the paper before it's fired. That's a little trickier, but it will work as a technique for metal clay as well. So I have on the table here a number of different examples of fold forming, and I'll just quickly go over them. Almost all of them start exactly the same way. And what I can do is show you on a piece of paper before I actually point out on the metal here. Think about taking a piece of paper and folding it. If I just fold it like this and unfold it, it has no mark on it. But if I fold this and then actually crease it like this, by forcing that edge down, when I undo the paper, it still has the mark of that fold. And it has two sides. It has this side, which is a peak, and it has this side, which is a valley. And that's the basis of fold forming, to tell you the truth. It's really pretty simple. But if I take that same piece and I fold it this way and then fold it this way, I'm going to have, when I unfold it completely, interestingly, I have on one side 3 valleys and 1 peak, or 3 peaks and 1 valley. That's another kind of fold. Now if you take a look how that manifests in metal, this is exactly what I just showed you. It has 3 peaks and 1 valley, or 3 valleys and 1 peak. Same thing here. These are all just different ways of folding and forging. And forging means when I strike a piece of metal with a metal hammer against metal. All 3 elements there have to be metal. If I take a plastic or neoprene or rawhide mallet and I hit it, that's not forging, that's forming. So I can form the metal, but it's not going to necessarily be permanent. I can undo that when I just hit it with one of these. But when I hit it with the metal hammer, I'm going to forge it, which means I'm actually compressing the metal and stretching it just a little bit. And that's what allows all of these forms to be made from flat pieces of stock. So I start out with just a plain piece of copper. I need to anneal it first. That's going to allow me to bend it a little more easily. The metal that the copper here at Cool Tools is actually what they call dead soft. So I don't even have to anneal this before I begin. I can just take that and fold it in my hands. And now I can take this and start to hammer this down a little bit, but then I would start to anneal it. I'll get into that in just a moment. Let me go back to some of these folds here. So this one I showed you, that's just taking it, folding it over twice like I did on the paper here. If I just fold it once, like this, let me do it lengthwise. If I just take it and fold it once like this, I can actually make something like these little, I call them boats, but they also look like pods. I'm sorry, I'll keep them down on the table here. They just look like pods, but I can start playing around with hanging things on the inside of them. And again, it's a way of making a 3-dimensional form out of a flat piece of copper. So what I did here is, on these, I just forge along this edge, and I'll get into that in a moment. Same thing here. This and this are actually exactly the same thing. It's just folded once. This is just taking and forging it more than I forged these to make that go in a complete U. As a matter of fact, I can actually make it go in a complete circle like this piece, where it overlaps. And there's a technique for when it overlaps like this. A neat thing about fold forms too is I can actually stretch this out and put it back, and it doesn't deform the piece at all. I can also take something like this and twist it, which is kind of cool. And I can twist it, and if I twist it back, it has not been deformed. I could just take my plier and pinch that edge to straighten it out again. And that's a really nice thing, element that you can use in making earrings and things. It really works very, very well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take and fold this over, and I'm going to hammer this down. Which is called a line fold. That's the basic fold. Now, if I want to forge this and do any work on it, before I do that, I have to anneal it. Okay, so I'm going to anneal the piece that I just folded, and I'm going to use this Big Shot that they sell here at Cool Tools. And this is a lot more powerful than a standard creme brulee torch. This will get you up to temperature. The creme brulee torches are not quite hot enough for this kind of annealing. When I fold it over, I'm going through 2 thicknesses of metal. So at some point, after I can see that this side is annealed, I do have to flip it over and just kind of lick it with the flame quickly to make sure that both sides have been annealed. So I'm going to take a look here as I'm heating this, and I'm going to look for the flame that is bouncing off of here. And I'm going to wait until that flame starts to turn orange. It's quite light in here, so it's a little bit more difficult to see, but I'm just going to kind of take a look at the color of the metal as well. And when I get a nice dull orange, I don't want it bright orange, just that dull orange. I think you can see when I take the torch away, just a little bit of dull orange, and I'll heat the entire piece to that color, and then I'll just come along and very quickly lick the other side to make sure it gets to that same dull orange color. And that's fully annealed. Now, I'm not going to dip that in water to quench it. I'm going to do something called heat sink cooling, which means I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it on a metal block, and I'm going to cover it with another metal block. These can be any kind of metal at all. It doesn't really matter. What that does is it sucks out the heat from the copper. The reason I'm not quenching that in water is that water goes in between those 2 layers. And then when I start hammering this, what happens is that water squirts out and you get a nice black line right across your waist of all of the fire stain that's on the copper. And I have a lot of aprons that have a black thing across the stomach here where I have forgotten that. So when it flakes like this, you can tell it's cool. It's perfectly cool. It takes about 10 or 15 seconds. And that fire scale just sloughs right off. And now I'm ready to forge. So what I'm going to do is I have a hammer here that has a round, kind of a crowned face, and also a cross peen. Peen means curve. So you have like a ball peen, which means it's round on the top and curves evenly all the way around it like a ball. This is a cross peen, meaning that it has a curve this way and it goes across the face of the hammer. And that's the kind of face that I need to do this fold forming. Now what happens is, if you think about a pie crust, when you have a pie crust and you start pinching that pie crust, you start getting these what are called crenellations, these wave on the side. And the reason that you have to do that is when you pinch those 2 pieces of dough together, you're actually lengthening around the pie. It's exactly the same thing is happening here. Instead of my finger, if you think about my finger, it's the same shape as a cross peen hammer. So what I'm doing is I'm actually pinching these 2 together and it lengthens that side. And what happens is this begins to curve, and I'll show you what that looks like. And also, as it begins to curve, I'm going to have these really lovely marks on here. And I can actually do what they call reading my hammer blows. What I'm looking for is, if I hammer straight, I'm going to get an uneven fold. What I need to do is I need to tilt my hammer ever so slightly. And what I have found is that if I tilt my head and my shoulders, my hammer tilts just a little tiny bit by itself. And that gives me just a little tiny bit of an angle. And when I strike this, I actually get a long triangle where the hammer blow has, and it fades off to here. And when I get into some other kinds of folds, that's actually very, very important, the length of that hammer blow. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come along now and repeat the hammer blows. If you notice, I'm working on the right side. As I'm looking at it, the right side of this block. I'm right-handed, so I work on the right side. If you're left-handed, it would be exactly the opposite, with the tilt going the opposite direction. So I'm going to hammer that along. It's pretty important to keep your fingers away from this. So what I'm going to do, if you noticed, I held it here as I'm going this way. And now I'm going to kind of hold it here off of the block, and I'm working right on the edge. I don't want it to hang over, but it's right on the edge, and I'm going to come along and make this series of hammer blows right along the edge. And the rule of thumb is you go in one direction at a time, back and forth once, then I can turn it over. But you can see that it has already begun to curve just a little bit. Now this fold, there's a lot of material out here that is resisting this. I'm going to also show you this exact same technique, only with a thinner piece, and you'll see that it curves very, very readily. So I'll hammer on one side, then I'll hammer on the other side. And now I've got that curve. And what I would do, in order to unfold this, I have to anneal it again. Before I anneal it, however, I always want to try to flatten out the piece. And I'm going to hold my fingers off of the block when I'm doing this. If I hold it like this, inevitably I'm going to hit myself. If I hold it here, even if I have an errant blow, my thumb is not between a rock and a hard place. And now what I can do is I'm just going to anneal this again. Okay, so I've annealed that piece that I was forging, and what I'm going to do is I usually have a knife around, like a butter knife or this. I've actually dulled this so it's not sharp. That's really important. You don't want to use a sharp knife for this, like an X-Acto or any kind of razor blade or a scalpel. So I have this old dull knife, and what I do is I just kind of wheedle that in between to give myself a little bit of space. And I can use my fingers to just unfold this, and immediately I had that perfectly flat sheet like this, and it has been transformed into a three-dimensional form. No soldering, by the way. So if I can actually have all of these different three-dimensional forms without having to put pieces together, just by the forging process. I can also open this up just a little bit more by putting it on the edge of the desk here and fold that, hammer that down just a little bit, and it flattens it out. I can also start playing around with this, and I can actually do something like this now. And what I've begun to do is make, if you think of it, part of a bezel. It's a little ridge in the middle of the metal here, and I can actually use that for a setting. If I wanted a stone or something or another object in here, I can actually just take that and I can push that over just like I would a bezel. And it's a really neat way of doing it. I might have like a bezel on the top here and maybe prongs around the other sides or something, but it's a really interesting way of starting a bezel, and it gives a completely different look. So now what I did is, that was a nice wide piece. I actually took my copper, folded it over so that I had a narrower strip, and then what I did is, here's the folded edge, and I actually cut with my shears, I cut this into kind of a boat shape, like this. Now, but this is the open edge, so if I open this up, I would just have a large oval of metal. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take and I'm going to exchange these curves, they call it. So what I'm going to do is, instead of this top being curved, that's going to go flat as I make this side curved. So I'm going to go back and do exactly the same thing. I'm going to start with my folded edge right on the right-hand side here, right at the very edge of my block. And in the center, where I have the most material, I'm going to hammer pretty hard. As I go down here, the amount of metal that I have to move is less, and you'll hear me actually back off of the force that I'm using for each hammer blow. So I'm going to start in the center, and I want to be careful not to go all the way across the metal. I just want to be on the edge. So you can see that I really lightened up my hammer blows, and that still moved that. So what I've done now is I've exchanged that curve which was going down, now that's straight and the bottom is curved up. What I've done is I've stretched this side, made it longer, and have it curve up like this. Now, the reason that I want to be really careful about not going all the way across, and I did a couple here, that's really bad, I shouldn't have done that. Because if you think about it, if I'm stretching this to make this longer, if I hammer all the way across, this side will be forcing down the opposite direction. So I want to make sure that my hammer blows only go halfway. A lot of people, when they start learning how to do this, and I have students do this, what I'll have them do is actually make a line on their metal halfway, just like this. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that your hammer blows don't cross that line. So again, what I'm doing is I'm actually leaning my body just a little bit to get the tilt of that hammer. And I will continue my hammer blows. And you can see that I'm coming up to the line, but I'm not crossing it. As I'm getting toward the end, I'm lightening up my hammer blows because I have almost no material to move here. Another interesting fact of fold forming is that as I open this fold now in this direction, the other direction, as I make that flat, the opposite plane, this way, actually curves up more. And they call, again, that's exchangeability of curvature. And I have a piece here that I did, and I'll show you this. So as I widen this fold, you can see how that space there is getting smaller and smaller as I open that up. And conversely, when I squeeze this together, what you're going to see is this whole thing starts to spread out. Just like that. I'm not forcing it out, it actually just does that because I'm compressing this. So as I open it, it means that it's going to start closing up. So when I'm making this little boat or pod, I can stop before this is perfectly straight, when it's still curved down a little bit, and then when I unfold it, it will come out with a straight edge like that on the top. So I'm going to anneal that, and I'm going to, in between, I'm going to actually do another one here, show you this. This is the opposite of what I was just doing. This is forging along the leg edge. This is the fold edge, this is the leg, they call it like this, right? So the leg edge, if I fold the leg edge and I open it up, I have an open space like this. When I forge on the fold edge, the opening is on the inside. So they're just opposite. Okay? This is pretty cool because what I can do is I can forge, I've made bracelets this way, and then I can actually put things like polymer clay in here or any other objects or just wires and things like that. And it can be a really beautiful kind of bracelet. I can also make I can also make pendants out of it. It'll be held this way. I can again start twisting this, and if I make this a little bit smaller, this could be a really interesting earring. And even when I do the regular fold on the the fold edge, I can do it really small. This is sterling silver, and these are earrings that I make. I leave this post on here and I put beads up there and I attach them, you know, and that would be it. This is just kind of in the middle of the process. But here is a really small fold form. Now I'm using a fairly large hammer here. Cool Tools sells the whole range of frets hammers. So if I'm doing a small piece like this, these smaller frets hammers are absolutely perfect for getting this kind of curve on smaller objects. And I can actually fold form really, really tiny things, but I would need to go down to a head like this. Something like this is just way too broad. You can also, if you're going really large, you can actually have a hammer that has a broader curve to it, which means that I'm compressing more metal and stretching it out even more with each hammer blow. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you another fold that I'm really fond of. I'm not sure what this one is named. Each of the folds has a name. And if you come up with a new fold, Charles, the guy that invented it, actually names it after you. So you might want to think about doing that. So what I have here is I have a fold that this and this are exactly the same thing. This is just this flattened out. And it's a really interesting way of getting texture on the surface of your metal without having to solder or anything else. And it's one of the only ways of doing that I've ever seen. So to make something like this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of metal, I have annealed it already, and I'm going to put this into my vise. And if you notice, I didn't hammer that flat. I just left it the fold. Nice curved fold. And I'm going to put the two legs into my vise, tighten that up. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come along and I'm going to hammer down on here to spread that out a little bit. And then I'm going to leave a space and hammer it down again. Leave a space and hammer it down again. And I can do this, if I had a 1 foot long piece, I can do that. And it works just fine. So I've got those all curved downward. Now what I'm going to do is take that out. I'll get rid of my vise here. And now what I'm going to do is hammer it down in the opposite direction. Instead of this way, I'm going to turn it 90 degrees and hammer down in between those gullies. So I'm going to hammer this down a little bit here and also at the ends. Turn it over, same thing. Once I get all the way down, and I can tell when I have that nice solid sound, I'm all the way down, it's going to look like that. And I kind of lost my gullies there a little bit. I could put it back in the vise and hammer those down again, but it's not really necessary. This will give me just a little bit different texture. Now what I would do is I would unfold this. And you can tell what I would have here is these are the gullies that I had made by hammering this way. These peaks are what I had hammered this way. And when I unfold it, it stays like this. If I wanted to flatten this out, I unfold it, and then I can start coaxing this down a little bit, like that. And I think you can see that that will yield this kind of texture. And I could actually do this again, exactly the same thing across like this, and have these crisscrossing going at an angle or anything I wanted to get this really, really fabulous texture on top of the metal. Again, without having to solder anything on there. I can still have this three-dimensional element on my metal. If you notice, I'm working on this bench block. And again, they sell them here at Cool Tools with this rubber base, and this makes an enormous difference for sound. It still bangs a lot, but it makes a it absorbs a lot of the sound. And you can actually, when you're hammering against the block, the decibel level of those hammer blows can actually be injurious to your ears. So you really want to, this is a really, really good idea. Another thing that you can do with the fold forms, when I have if I do a lot of folds in a piece like this, I can flatten it out. Then I can take this with all of this visual information on it, and I can actually die form it. Die forming is kind of pressing it through a hole that I've made in like plexiglass or something called faux bone. I'll be showing that in another segment. And it kind of puffs it up. And if you work it right, if you've actually hammered this so it's a little bit thin, as you puff that up, you can actually get these splits. And I happen to really like that. And I've actually used that in a lot of work. So I have this and I can cut away this or leave this or make this into a box. I can do a lot of things. I also took the exact same technique of folds. These are where it was folded. And I had hammered it really, really thin, knowing that I wanted it to split. I die formed it. And then in the split now, I have forced a little bit of polymer clay up and painted the polymer clay. Now I'm going to attach this to a background piece and form it into a finished piece of jewelry. I can also use the techniques that I was talking about before, where I just hammer, I keep hammering to trap pieces in here. So this is a piece of polymer clay, and it actually fits right into this little fold form. And that allows me to start attaching other pieces, and that's a really good way of setting it without a bezel. So I can actually make this go all the way around if I wanted as well. I have another piece here that I had done exactly the same thing. This is bronze metal clay. And I had mounted a stone on here, and I took the bronze clay, and instead of just hanging it by itself, I actually made a silver fold form that goes all the way around it on both sides. And then I put in one rivet to hold it in place so it can't retract out. And now I'm going to hang it, instead of just here, which would be expected, now I can actually hang it from here. And this becomes simply a design element as opposed to an attachment. So this fold forming allows you to start trapping virtually any kind of object you would like. And again, if you think about it, there's no soldering in anything that I've been doing. And I still have all of these three-dimensional forms. So that's fold forming kind of 101. And I say 101 only because you can go on with fold forming forever. There are numerous techniques, numerous kinds of folds that will all yield a different texture and different forms. You can check online. It's a very, very popular metalworking technique. And if you look online, you'll find all sorts of different folds. You can also just Google Charles Lewton-Brain, and he's the originator of this again, and you'll have a whole history of fold forming, along with all of the different variations you can use in your own work. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you again soon.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.